The snow fell upon London with a silence that seemed to mock the chaos within Edward Fitzwilliam's chest. He stood at the window of his Mayfair townhouse, watching the white flakes settle upon the cobblestones below, each one a small, cold reminder that Christmas Eve had arrived, and with it the terrible knowledge that he had miscalculated everything. The Duke of Grammont was not a man accustomed to error. At 34, he had inherited not only one of England's oldest titles, but also a reputation for precision in all matters, financial, political, and social. He moved through the world with the certainty of one whose lineage stretched back to the conquest, whose every word carried the weight of generations. Women pursued him with a determination that bordered on desperation. Mothers presented their daughters like offerings at a shrine. Yet Edward had remained unmoved, untouched, his heart a fortress that none had breached, until her, Miss Charlotte Pemberton, had entered his life 6 months prior, arriving in London as companion to her elderly aunt, Lady Hartwell. She possessed neither fortune nor exceptional beauty by society's exacting standards. Her gowns were well made but not fashionable, her manner pleasant but not effusive. She moved through ballrooms like a ghost, present but somehow apart, her grey eyes observing everything with a quiet intelligence that most overlooked. Edward had noticed her immediately, though he told himself he had not. It was at the Duchess of Marlborough's summer ball that he first heard her speak. She had been standing near the terrace doors, listening to Lord Pemberton, a distant relation, pontificate about the Reform Bill with all the subtlety of a canon. Edward had been passing when he heard her voice, soft but clear. But surely, Lord Pemberton, if we consider the matter from the perspective of those who actually work the land, rather than merely own it, the picture becomes rather different, does it not? The silence that followed was profound. Lord Pemberton's face had turned an alarming shade of crimson. Edward had stopped, intrigued despite himself, and watched as Charlotte continued, her tone never rising, never losing its gentle courtesy, yet dismantling Pemberton's arguments with a precision that left the man sputtering. When she finished, she had turned, perhaps sensing Edward's gaze, and their eyes met. For a moment, a single, suspended moment, he had felt something shift within him, like ice cracking on a frozen lake. Then she had offered a small curtsy and moved away, leaving him standing alone with the strangest sensation of having been seen, truly seen, for the first time in his life. He should have spoken to her then. He should have crossed the ballroom, claimed her hand for a dance, begun the courtship that every instinct in his body was screaming for. But Edward was a duke, and dukes did not act on impulse. Dukes did not chase after penniless companions with unfashionable gowns and opinions that bordered on radical. Dukes certainly did not feel their hearts race at the memory of grey eyes that seemed to look straight through all pretense to the man beneath. So he had done nothing. Over the following months, he had seen her often. London society, for all its vastness, was remarkably small in its upper reaches. She attended the same gatherings, always in her aunt's shadow, always observing, always maintaining that careful distance. Edward found himself aware of her presence in every room they shared. He would position himself where he might catch fragments of her conversation, where he might observe the way candlelight caught in her dark hair, where he might see the small smile that touched her lips when someone said something particularly absurd. He told himself it was mere curiosity. He told himself she was an interesting diversion, nothing more. He told himself that the tightness in his chest when other men approached her was simply indigestion from too rich food. He had become a spectacular liar. The turning point had come 3 weeks ago at the Harrington musicale. Edward had arrived late, taking his customary position at the back of the room, where he might observe without participating. Charlotte had been seated near the pianoforte, her hands folded in her lap, her attention fixed on the young woman performing a complicated sonata. When the piece concluded, Lady Harrington had called upon Charlotte to play. Edward had seen the flash of reluctance cross her face, quickly hidden. She had risen, moved to the instrument with that same quiet grace, and settled herself before the keys with visible hesitation. Then she had begun to play. Edward could not have named the piece. His musical education, while thorough, had not prepared him for what flowed from beneath her fingers. It was not technically perfect. There were small hesitations, moments where her hands seemed to search for notes, but it was devastatingly beautiful. The melody was melancholic, yearning, filled with a depth of feeling that seemed impossible from someone so young, so seemingly untouched by tragedy. He had watched her face as she played, watched the way her eyes closed, the way her entire being seemed to pour into the music, and he had understood with terrible clarity that she was not untouched. Whatever sorrows she carried them deep, hidden beneath that calm exterior, revealed only in moments like this, when her guard was lowered. When the final notes faded, there had been a moment of profound silence before polite applause filled the room. Charlotte had risen, curtsied, and returned to her seat, her face once again composed, once again that pleasant mask she showed the world. Edward had left immediately, unable to bear remaining in that room, unable to face the truth that was rising within him like a tide. He was in love with her. The realization had terrified him. Love was for younger sons, for poets, for fools who had not learned that feeling led only to weakness. His own father had loved his mother with a devotion that bordered on madness, and when she died, he had followed her within the year, leaving Edward at 15 to shoulder the weight of the dukedom alone. Edward had sworn then that he would never allow himself such vulnerability, would never give another person the power to destroy him so completely. So he had run. Not physically, a duke did not run, but emotionally. He had avoided the gatherings he knew she would attend. He had thrown himself into estate business, into parliamentary debates, into anything that might keep him from thinking about grey eyes and music that revealed hidden sorrows. For 3 weeks, he had been successful. Then, yesterday morning, Lady Hartwell's footman had arrived with a message. Edward could still feel the weight of the sealed note in his hand, could still remember the strange sense of foreboding that had gripped him as he broke the wax. Lady Hartwell's spidery handwriting had been brief and to the point. She was departing London for Bath on Christmas Eve to take the waters for her health. Her companion, Miss Pemberton, would be travelling with her. They would be gone indefinitely, perhaps permanently. Lady Hartwell had thought His Grace might wish to know, should he have any particular interest in the matter. The old woman had known. Somehow, she had seen what Edward had tried so desperately to hide, even from himself. He had one day, one single day, to decide whether to let Charlotte leave, to preserve his carefully constructed defences, to maintain the isolation that had protected him for so many years, or to risk everything. Edward had spent the night in his study, a glass of brandy growing warm in his hand, watching the fire burn low. Pride warred with longing, fear battled with desperate need. He thought of his father, broken by love. He thought of Charlotte's music, filled with unspoken pain. He thought of grey eyes that had seen him, truly seen him, and had not looked away. As dawn broke over London, he had made his decision. He would go to her. He would speak. He would offer himself, his title, his fortune, his carefully guarded heart, and accept whatever answer she gave. But first, he needed to attend to estate business that could not be delayed, correspondence that required his immediate attention. It was merely a few hours' work. She was not leaving until the afternoon. There was time. There was always time. Now, standing at his window as snow fell upon Christmas Eve, Edward realized he had made the greatest miscalculation of his life. The clock on the mantel struck 2. Lady Hartwell's carriage had been scheduled to depart at noon. Charlotte was gone. Edward remained at the window long after darkness fell, watching London transform into something strange and otherworldly beneath its blanket of snow. The city's usual cacophony had softened to whispers and muffled footsteps. Carriages passed less frequently, their wheels leaving dark tracks that filled almost immediately with fresh white. Christmas Eve had emptied the streets of all but the most determined travellers, and Edward found himself envying them their purpose, their destinations, their certainty. His own certainty had abandoned him entirely. The brandy glass in his hand, his third or perhaps fourth, had grown warm again. He set it aside untouched and pressed his forehead against the cold window pane, seeking some physical sensation that might override the hollow ache spreading through his chest. He had been 7 years old when his mother died. The memory rose unbidden, as clear as if it had happened yesterday rather than 27 years ago. She had been ill for months, wasting away in her chambers, while doctors murmured their useless platitudes and his father paced the corridors like a caged animal. Edward had been kept away, deemed too young to witness such suffering, but he had heard his father's voice late at night, talking to her, reading to her, begging her in a broken whisper not to leave him. The day she died, his father had emerged from her chambers a different man. The Duke of Grammont, powerful, decisive, feared in Parliament and admired in society, had simply ceased to exist. What remained was a hollow shell that moved through the motions of living without any spark of actual life. Edward had watched his father fade over the following year. He stopped eating properly. He neglected the estates. He spent hours in his late wife's chambers, surrounded by her things, speaking to her as if she might answer. The servants whispered. The family solicitors grew concerned, and Edward, barely 15 when his father finally surrendered to grief and followed his wife to the grave, had stood in the family chapel and sworn an oath he had kept for 19 years. Never again would a Fitzwilliam love so unwisely. Never again would a Duke of Grammont give another person such power over his happiness, his sanity, his very life. Edward had built his existence upon that oath. He had chosen his associates carefully, cultivating relationships based on mutual respect and shared interests rather than affection. He had pursued women discreetly, appropriately, who understood that pleasure and companionship need not involve emotion. He had transformed himself into exactly what a duke should be: untouchable, unshakable, immune to the weaknesses that destroyed lesser men. And then Charlotte Pemberton had looked at him, across a ballroom, and everything he had built began to crumble. He had not even realized it was happening at first. Their second meeting had been unremarkable by any external measure. It was at the theatre, during the interval of some tedious production he could no longer recall. Edward had been making his way through the crush of bodies in the corridor when he had nearly collided with her. "Forgive me, Your Grace." She had stepped back immediately, her eyes lowering in proper deference. But not before he had caught something in her expression, a flash of recognition, of awareness, that sent an unexpected jolt through him. "The fault was entirely mine, Miss—" He had known her name, of course. He had made discreet inquiries after the Marlborough ball, but propriety demanded the pretense. "Pemberton, Your Grace, Miss Charlotte Pemberton." "Are you enjoying the performance, Miss Pemberton?" She had hesitated, and in that hesitation he had seen something marvelous. She was considering whether to lie, to offer the expected pleasantries, and deciding against it. "I find the leading lady's interpretation somewhat overwrought, I confess. The role calls for subtlety, I think, rather than grand gestures." Then she had colored slightly, as if suddenly aware she was criticizing to a duke. "But I am certain my opinion is uninformed. I have limited experience with the theatre." On the contrary, Edward had found himself leaning slightly closer, drawn in despite himself. "I believe your assessment is entirely correct. Overwrought is precisely the word. What would you do differently if you were directing the piece?" Her eyes had lifted to his then, and he had seen surprise there, and something else. Interest, perhaps, or the beginning of it. I would have her speak more quietly in the confession scene, let the audience lean forward to hear, make them complicit in her secret, rather than bludgeoning them with it. "Yes?" The word had emerged with more force than he intended. "Yes, exactly that." They had stood there in the crowded corridor, the noise of society swirling around them, and talked about the play, about theatre, about the nature of performance and artifice and truth. Edward could not remember later what precisely had been said. He remembered only the way her face had animated as she spoke, the way her hands had moved to emphasize a point, the way she had listened when he replied, truly listened, not simply waiting for her turn to speak. When the bell rang to signal the interval's end, he had felt an absurd disappointment, as if something precious had been cut short. "Thank you for your insights, Miss Pemberton. You have made this tedious evening considerably more tolerable." "I might say the same, Your Grace." She had curtsied and turned to go, then paused. "Though I wonder if you find most evenings tedious?" The question had been bold, almost impertinent. From anyone else he might have taken offense, but there had been no malice in her eyes, only genuine curiosity. "More than I care to admit," he had said, and watched something like understanding cross her face before she disappeared back into the theatre. That night, he had lain awake in his chambers, replaying the conversation, analyzing his own reactions with growing unease. The tightness in his chest when she smiled, the way time had seemed to slow when they spoke. The eagerness, yes, eagerness, that most undignified of emotions, with which he had awaited her responses. It meant nothing, he had told himself. An engaging conversation with an intelligent woman, nothing more. But he had found himself at every subsequent event, hoping to see her, positioning himself where their paths might cross, manufacturing opportunities for casual encounter, and each time they spoke, brief exchanges about books, about music, about the absurdities of fashionable society, he felt that same dangerous pull, that same sense of something shifting and cracking in the foundations of his carefully ordered life. The closest he had come to acknowledging the truth was 3 months ago, at the Devonshire garden party. It had been an unusually warm October afternoon, and the guests had spilled out onto the manicured lawns. Edward had been trapped in conversation with Lord Hastings, enduring the man's tedious opinions on crop rotation, when he had heard Charlotte's laugh. It was not a sound he had heard before. Her usual demeanor was so quiet, so contained, that the bright, unguarded joy in that laugh had struck him like a physical blow. He had turned, searching for the source, and found her standing beneath an oak tree with a group of young people, her head tilted back, her eyes bright with genuine amusement at something one of them had said. And beside her, standing too close, looking at her with unmistakable admiration, had been Captain James Worthing. The jealousy that had seized Edward was immediate and irrational and absolutely terrifying. Worthing was everything. Edward was not. Young, charming, easy in his manner, unburdened by the weight of ancient titles and terrible responsibilities. He was making Charlotte laugh, making her eyes dance, making her look alive in a way Edward had never managed to achieve in all their careful, proper conversations. Edward had excused himself from Hastings and walked directly into the house, seeking refuge in Devonshire's library. His hands had been shaking, his heart had been racing, and he had known, standing there, among the leather-bound volumes, that he was in serious danger. He had avoided her completely after that for nearly a fortnight. When next they met at Lady Ashford's dinner, he had been coldly polite, distant, determined to re-establish the appropriate boundaries. Charlotte had noticed immediately. He had seen the confusion in her eyes, the hurt she tried to hide. And later, when he had overheard her quietly asking Lady Hartwell if she had somehow given offence to the Duke of Greymont, he had felt something inside him twist painfully. "You have given no offence," he had wanted to tell her. "You have simply made me feel things I swore never to feel again. You have made me want things I cannot allow myself to want. You have made me remember what it is to be human, rather than simply a title and a name." But he had said nothing, had maintained his distance, had told himself it was for the best, for both of them. Now, standing in his darkened study, as snow fell upon a city emptying itself for Christmas, Edward understood what his father had felt in those final months, that desperate, clawing need to hold on to something precious even as it slipped through your fingers, that willingness to surrender pride, dignity, everything, for one more moment, one more chance. His father had been broken by love, yes, but perhaps, and this was the thought that cut deepest, perhaps his father had also been blessed by it. Perhaps those years with Edward's mother, however brief, however ending in tragedy, had been worth the price of the pain that followed. Edward had spent 19 years trying to avoid that pain, and in doing so, he had ensured he would never know that joy. The clock struck 9. Charlotte would be in Bath by now, or nearly there. She would be helping Lady Hartwell settle into their lodgings, ordering tea, perhaps sitting by a fire in some rented rooms, believing herself forgotten by everyone in London who mattered. She could not know that in Mayfair, a duke stood in darkness, finally understanding that he had inherited more from his father than a title and estates. He had inherited a capacity for love so deep and fierce that even 19 years of deliberate suppression could not kill it. It had simply waited, dormant, for the right person to awaken it. Edward turned from the window and moved to his desk. He lit a candle with hands that still trembled slightly, pulled out a fresh sheet of paper, and began to write. Not to Charlotte. That would be inappropriate, presumptuous, everything he had spent a lifetime avoiding, but to his estate steward in Bath, requesting information on suitable lodgings for an extended stay. He would follow her. Not immediately. That would be too obvious, too desperate. But soon. He would find a way to be near her, to speak with her properly, to discover if the connection he felt was mutual or merely his own delusion. And if she rejected him? If she had no interest in a man who had spent months running from his own feelings, then he would accept it. But he would not, could not simply let her vanish from his life without at least making the attempt. Outside, church bells began to ring, calling the faithful to Christmas Eve services. Edward listened to them echo across the snow-covered city and felt something inside him shift and settle into place. Not peace, not yet, but purpose, direction. He had spent too long hiding from life, too long using his father's tragedy as an excuse to avoid his own happiness, too long mistaking isolation for strength. That ended tonight. Bath revealed itself through morning mist like a stage set slowly illuminated, all honey-coloured stone and elegant crescents rising above the valley. Edward's carriage descended into the city 3 days after Christmas, the wheels finding purchase on roads slick with recent rain. He had told no one the true reason for his journey, citing only a need to inspect certain properties and consult with his solicitors. His valet had accepted the explanation without question. Dukes, after all, required no justification for their movements. The lodgings his steward had secured overlooked the royal crescent, sufficiently grand to suit his station without drawing undue attention. Edward established himself there with his customary efficiency, unpacked his essentials, and spent the remainder of the day walking the city's streets in the fading afternoon light, reacquainting himself with a place he had not visited since university. He did not search for Charlotte, not yet. First he needed to understand the landscape, both physical and social. Bath was smaller than London, its society more concentrated, its gossip more immediate. Any action he took would be noted, discussed, interpreted. He must proceed with care. That evening, he dined alone in his rooms and composed a note to Lady Hartwell, expressing his surprise at discovering they were both taking the waters at the same time, and requesting permission to call upon her at her convenience. It was perfectly proper, perfectly reasonable. Lady Hartwell moved in the highest circles. It would be stranger if he did not acknowledge her presence. The reply came the following morning. Lady Hartwell would be delighted to receive his grace at 4 o'clock that afternoon. Her lodgings, she noted, were in Queen Square, considerably more modest than his own, but comfortable enough for an elderly widow and her companion. Edward spent the intervening hours in a state of anticipation he had not experienced since boyhood. He changed his coat 3 times, dismissed his valet's attempts at conversation, and arrived at Queen Square precisely on time, his heart beating with uncharacteristic irregularity. Lady Hartwell received him in a pleasant drawing-room overlooking the square's garden. She was alone. "Your Grace." She inclined her head from her position on the sofa, her sharp eyes taking in everything about him with an assessment that made Edward feel suddenly transparent. "How kind of you to call. I confess myself quite surprised to learn you were in Bath. I had thought you planned to spend the season at Greymont." "Plans change, Lady Hartwell." Edward settled into the chair she indicated, accepting tea he did not want. "I found myself in need of a change of scene." The sound was eloquent with disbelief. "And this sudden need coincided entirely by chance with my own departure from London." There was no point in dissembling. Lady Hartwell had not survived 70 years in society by being oblivious. "Your letter mentioned you were leaving London with Miss Pemberton," Edward said carefully. "I found myself concerned about her well-being." "Did you indeed?" Lady Hartwell set down her teacup with a sharp click. "How fascinating, given that you spent the last month avoiding her with an assiduousness that bordered on the comical. Tell me, Your Grace, do you make a habit of pursuing women you have been studiously ignoring?" The directness was shocking, even from a woman of Lady Hartwell's age and status. Edward felt heat rise in his face, an unfamiliar sensation for a man who prided himself on perpetual composure. "I had my reasons for maintaining distance." "I am certain you did. Men of your position always have reasons, usually terrible ones." Lady Hartwell regarded him with something that might have been sympathy. "Charlotte is not some pampered debutante looking for a title and fortune, Your Grace. She has experienced enough disappointment in her young life without adding you to the list." Edward's hands tightened on the arms of his chair. I have no intention of disappointing her. Quite the opposite. Intentions are worth little without action. Lady Hartwell paused, then sighed. She is at the pump room at present. She goes there most mornings to take the waters and sketch. The company bores her, but she is too polite to refuse my requests that she go. It was permission, Edward realized. Grudging, qualified, but permission nonetheless. He rose. Thank you, Lady Hartwell. Do not thank me yet. Win her trust if you can. You have considerable ground to make up. The pump room was everything Edward remembered and despised. Elegant architecture filled with aging invalids, social climbers, and the desperately hopeful, all pretending that sulphurous water might cure what ailed them. He entered through the main doors and paused, scanning the crowd. He found Charlotte almost immediately, seated on a bench near the windows, a small sketchbook open on her lap. She wore a simple day dress in dove grey, her dark hair pulled back simply, no jewelry save a small locket at her throat. She looked absorbed in her work, her pencil moving across the page with quick, certain strokes, oblivious to the social theatre unfolding around her. Edward began to make his way toward her, dodging elderly ladies and their attendants. He was perhaps 10 paces away when a gentleman approached. Charlotte from the other side, blocking Edward's path. Captain James Worthing, of course. Edward stopped, his breath catching, and watched as Worthing bent over Charlotte's shoulder to examine her sketch. Watched as she looked up, surprised, then smiled. That same bright, unguarded smile Edward had seen in the Devonshire gardens. Watched as Worthing settled himself beside her on the bench, far closer than propriety strictly allowed, his attention focused entirely on her face. Captain Worthing, what an unexpected pleasure. Charlotte's voice carried clearly in the cavernous space, warm with genuine delight. I had no idea you were in Bath. Arrived yesterday. My mother has decided the waters might help her constitution. Worthing gestured vaguely toward a well-dressed matron across the room. Personally, I suspect she simply wanted an excuse to escape London's winter. May I see what you are working on? Charlotte tilted the sketchbook toward him, and Edward watched Worthing's face transform with appreciation. Whatever she had drawn, it had impressed him considerably. Miss Pemberton, this is remarkable. You have captured the architecture beautifully, but more than that, there is something in the quality of light, the way you have rendered the shadows. Worthing looked at her with undisguised admiration. You have genuine talent. Edward watched Charlotte colour with pleasure, watched her duck her head in modest demurral, watched the easy way she and Worthing fell into. Conversation about art and technique and perspective. He remained frozen in place, trapped behind a large potted plant, unable to either advance or retreat without drawing attention to himself. Have you visited the assembly rooms yet? Worthing was asking. There is a subscription ball tomorrow evening. I would be honoured if you would reserve a dance for me. Lady Hartwell has not yet decided if we are attending. Then I shall make it my mission to convince her. A lady with your appreciation. For architecture must see the assembly rooms. They are quite magnificent. Edward's hands clenched at his sides. The ease between them was evident, natural. Worthing could offer Charlotte laughter, lightness, the kind of uncomplicated affection that Edward, with all his emotional barriers and aristocratic reserve, had never managed to provide. Worthing had no dead parents haunting him, no terrible oaths sworn in family chapels, no fear of feeling too much. Worthing was everything Edward was not, and Charlotte clearly enjoyed his company. The jealousy that rose in Edward's chest was a living thing, hot and bitter and entirely irrational. He had no claim on Charlotte. He had actively avoided her for weeks. He had no right to feel betrayed by her enjoyment of another man's attention, but he did. God help him, he did. Your Grace? Edward turned to find Mrs. Pemberton, Charlotte's distant relation from the Marlborough ball, regarding him with barely concealed curiosity. I thought that was you. How delightful to see you in Bath. Are you taking the waters? Simply visiting. Edward forced his attention away from Charlotte and Worthing, forced his voice into some semblance of normalcy. And yourself? Oh, I come every January. My rheumatism, you understand. Mrs. Pemberton launched into a detailed description of her various ailments, a monologue Edward endured with practiced patience, while his peripheral vision remained locked on Charlotte. She was laughing at something Worthing had said. Her whole face had transformed, luminous with amusement, and Edward felt something crack inside him at the sight. That was how she should always look, happy, alive, free from the constraints of proper behavior and social expectation. He wanted to be the one who brought that expression to her face. He wanted her to look at him the way she was looking at Worthing, with openness and trust and uncomplicated pleasure. But he had forfeited that right through his own cowardice. "Don't you agree, Your Grace?" Edward realized Mrs. Pemberton had asked him a question. "Forgive me, my attention wandered. You were saying?" "That young Worthing has been quite attentive to our dear Charlotte. Such a pleasant young man, and so suitable. I do hope something might come of it." The word struck like a blow. "Suitable? Oh yes. His family is old, if not particularly wealthy, and he seems genuinely fond of her. And Charlotte deserves some happiness, poor dear, after everything she has endured." Edward wanted to ask what Charlotte had endured, wanted to demand details of the sorrows he had sensed but never questioned. Instead, he said only, "Indeed, every lady deserves happiness." "Quite so. Will you be attending the subscription ball tomorrow? I am certain Charlotte would be delighted to see you there." Edward watched Charlotte and Worthing rise from their bench, watched Worthing offer his arm, watched her take it with easy grace. "I am uncertain of my plans," he managed. That was a lie. He would be at the assembly rooms tomorrow if he had to purchase the building to gain entrance. He would dance with Charlotte, would speak with her, would begin the impossible task of undoing the damage his pride had caused. But first, he had to endure watching her walk away on another man's arm, her laughter floating back across the pump room like music he would never be allowed to make. Edward excused himself from Mrs. Pemberton and left the building, stepping out into cold, afternoon air that did nothing to cool the fever burning in his blood. He walked without direction through Bath's elegant streets, his mind churning with images of Charlotte and Worthing, of easy smiles and unguarded laughter, of everything he wanted and could not seem to claim. By the time he returned to his lodgings, darkness had fallen and a plan had formed. Tomorrow evening, at the assembly rooms, he would approach Charlotte properly. He would be charming, attentive, everything she deserved. He would show her the man he could be when he was not hiding behind walls of his own construction, and if Worthing stood in his way, then Edward would prove that a duke, when properly motivated, could be far more formidable than any captain. He had spent too long in retreat. Tomorrow he would advance. The assembly rooms glittered with candlelight and ambition. Edward arrived early, positioning himself where he might observe the entrance without appearing to lurk. The ballroom was magnificent, exactly as Worthing had promised Charlotte it would be. Soaring ceilings, crystal chandeliers, walls lined with mirrors that multiplied the elegance ad infinitum. An orchestra tuned their instruments in the corner, the discordant notes somehow fitting the anticipatory tension Edward felt coiling in his chest. He had dressed with unusual care, dismissing his valet's first 3 attempts before settling on evening clothes of austere elegance that emphasized his rank without ostentation. He wanted Charlotte to see him as a man, not merely a title, though how one separated the two when they had been fused together since birth was a question he could not answer. Lady Hartwell arrived precisely at 9, moving slowly on her companion's arm. Charlotte was exquisite in pale blue silk that caught the candlelight with every movement, simple in cut, but perfect in execution. She wore no jewelry save that same small locket, her dark hair arranged in soft curls that framed her face. Edward felt his breath catch at the sight of her, felt that same dangerous pull he had been trying to deny for months. Then Worthing appeared at her elbow, and Edward's hands clenched involuntarily. The captain looked annoyingly well in his dress uniform, all gleaming buttons and easy confidence. He claimed Charlotte's hand for the opening dance, a right Edward should have secured through earlier arrangement, but had not. Another failure to add to his growing list. Edward watched them take their positions for the quadrille, watched Worthing lean close to murmur something that made Charlotte smile, and felt jealousy claw at his composure with renewed ferocity. He endured the dance by force of will alone, making stilted conversation with the various matrons who approached him, accepting their daughters' curtsies with mechanical politeness. His attention never wavered from Charlotte as she moved through the figures with unconscious grace, her pleasure in the dance evident in every step. When the music finally concluded, Edward moved. He intercepted Charlotte before Worthing could escort her from the floor, materializing at her side with the decisiveness that had served him well in both Parliament and business. "Miss Pemberton, what an unexpected pleasure to find you in Bath." Charlotte's eyes widened, genuine surprise flickering across her face before being quickly hidden behind that pleasant mask he had come to know so well. "Your Grace, I was not aware you were in the city. I arrived several days ago. May I have the honor of the next dance?" It was not a request any sensible woman could refuse from a duke, and they both knew it. But Edward saw something flash in her eyes, hurt, perhaps, or anger, before she inclined her head in acquiescence. "You are too kind, Your Grace." The words were perfectly proper, but her tone held a coolness that Edward had never heard directed at him before. Worthing, still standing beside her, made his displeasure evident through the set of his shoulders, but could do nothing as Edward led Charlotte back onto the floor for a waltz. The music began, and Edward placed his hand at her waist, feeling the warmth of her through the silk. They began to turn, and for a moment neither spoke, the silence between them heavy with unvoiced questions. "You have been well, Miss Pemberton?" Edward finally asked, hating the formality but unsure how to break through it. "Quite well, thank you." Her eyes remained fixed somewhere past his shoulder. "Lady Hartwell finds Bath agrees with her constitution. We are very comfortable in our lodgings." "I am glad to hear it." Another turn. The mirrors reflected them endlessly, a duke and a companion, the picture of propriety. "I trust you are finding sufficient occupation to ward off boredom. Captain Worthing has been kind enough to introduce me to several of Bath's cultural offerings. I have been sketching the architecture. It provides adequate amusement." The mention of Worthing's name was deliberate, Edward realized. A small rebellion against his presumption in claiming this dance. He felt irritation rise to join the jealousy already churning in his gut. "Captain Worthing seems quite attentive. He is a gentleman, one of nature's rare examples." The edge in her voice was unmistakable now. Edward's jaw tightened. "You speak as if gentlemanly behavior is somehow unusual in your experience. My experience has taught me that actions, not words, define a gentleman. That consistency of character matters more than elevated rank." Charlotte's eyes finally met his, and Edward saw anger there, barely controlled. That a man who engages one in conversation one day and ignores one the next without explanation is perhaps not a gentleman at all, regardless of his title. The accusation struck home with precision. Edward felt heat rise in his face, felt his own anger kindle in response, not at her, but at the truth of her words, at his own behavior, at the impossible situation his cowardice had created. "You cannot possibly understand the complexities." "Then explain them to me." Charlotte's voice remained low, but intensity vibrated through every word. "Explain why you sought my company for months, why you engaged me in conversations that suggested genuine interest, and then suddenly treated me as if I were invisible. Explain why you fled London the moment I expressed any real opinion, why you made me doubt my own perceptions, my own worth. That was never my intentions again." Her laugh was bitter, echoing something Lady Hartwell had said. Men of rank are so comfortable hiding behind intentions while their actions wound with impunity. They were drawing attention now, other dancers noting the intensity of their exchange. Edward forced himself to moderate his tone, to maintain the appearance of pleasant conversation while his entire world narrowed to the woman in his arms and the truths she was forcing him to face. "I was protecting us both," he said quietly. "You do not know what you ask." "I ask for nothing, I never did." Charlotte's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and Edward felt something inside him twist painfully. "I am well aware of the distance between our stations, Your Grace. I harbor no illusions about what might be possible, but I believed we had achieved friendship at least. I believed mutual respect was not entirely beyond reach." "It is not. Then why?" The question emerged raw, unguarded. "Why did you make me care and then abandon me without explanation? Why did you make me believe I mattered and then prove I did not?" The music was ending. Edward felt time running out, felt the moment slipping through his fingers, even as he struggled to find words adequate to the truth. Around them, other couples were separating, bowing, moving off the floor. They had seconds, perhaps less. "You matter more than you can possibly understand," Edward said desperately. That is precisely the problem. Charlotte pulled away from him as the final notes faded. I am not a problem to be solved, Your Grace. I am a person. But I see now that you will never understand the distinction. She curtsied, perfect form, perfect deportment, and turned away, walking directly to where Worthing waited at the edge of the floor. Edward watched her take the captain's arm, watched her murmur something that made Worthing shoot him a look of undisguised triumph, watched them disappear into the crowd. He stood alone in the middle of the ballroom floor, aware of curious eyes, of whispered speculation, of the spectacle he had just created. A duke did not display emotion in public. A duke did not stand frozen like a statue while a penniless companion rejected him. But Edward was not feeling particularly ducal at the moment. He was feeling, for the first time in 19 years, utterly and completely lost. He left the assembly rooms without speaking to anyone, his departure doubtless fueling gossip that would spread. Through Bath before sunrise, he walked through cold streets, his evening clothes inadequate against the January wind, not caring. Charlotte's words echoed in his mind with relentless accuracy. Why did you make me care, and then abandon me without explanation? Because he was afraid. Because caring led to loss, and loss led to the kind of destruction he had witnessed in his father. Because opening himself to love meant accepting vulnerability, and vulnerability meant potential devastation. But in protecting himself, he had devastated her instead. Edward found himself at the river, watching dark water flow past, infinite and uncaring. His father had stood at this same spot, years ago, before Edward was born. His mother had told him the story, how the elder duke had proposed to her here, offering his heart with a sincerity that had swept away all her reservations. They had been happy, his parents, deliriously, completely happy, for the years they had together. Was the pain of losing that happiness enough to negate the joy of having experienced it? His father, in the end, had thought so, had surrendered to grief rather than finding a way to continue living. But perhaps, and this thought struck Edward with the force of revelation, perhaps his father's mistake had not been loving too much but grieving too absolutely. Perhaps the tribute to his mother's memory should have been to live fully, to honor her, by embracing life rather than surrendering to death. Edward had spent 19 years refusing to live, using his father's tragedy as justification for his own emotional cowardice, and in doing so, he had hurt the one person who had broken through his defenses, who had made him feel alive for the first time since childhood. Charlotte believed she was beneath his notice, unworthy of his regard. She believed his withdrawal had been about her inadequacy rather than his own fear. She believed she did not matter, and he, through pride and silence and stubborn refusal to be honest, had allowed her to believe it. The church bells struck midnight, calling out the hour across sleeping Bath. Edward turned from the river and began walking back toward his lodgings, his mind clearing, his purpose forming. He could not undo the hurt he had caused, but he could stop adding to it. He could stop hiding behind rank and propriety and carefully maintain distance. He could do what he should have done months ago, tell Charlotte the truth, regardless of the cost to his pride. And, if she still chose Worthing, if his honesty came too late to change her heart, then at least he would have tried. At least he would have lived, however briefly, rather than continuing this half-existence that called itself safety, but was merely another name for fear. Tomorrow he would speak to her properly, not in a ballroom surrounded by gossips, but privately, honestly, laying his heart bare in a way he had sworn never to do. It was terrifying. It was necessary. It was perhaps already too late. But Edward had finally understood what his father knew all along. Some things were worth the risk of devastation. Love was one of them. Morning came grey and cold, rain drumming against Edward's windows with monotonous insistence. He had not slept. The night had passed in restless pacing, in rehearsing and discarding various speeches, in confronting truths he had spent 19 years avoiding. By dawn, he had achieved a clarity that felt both liberating and terrifying. He would go to Charlotte today, would speak plainly, would offer her everything he was and accept whatever answer she gave. But first, breakfast. Even revelations required fuel. He was halfway through toast he could not taste when his valet entered with the morning post. Edward sorted through the usual correspondence, estate matters, social invitations, a note from his steward, until he reached a letter bearing Lady Hartwell's seal. His hands stilled. He had not expected to hear from her so soon after last. Night's disaster at the assembly rooms. The letter was brief and devastating. Your Grace, I write to inform you that Miss Pemberton and I will be departing Bath this afternoon, returning to London by way of my sister's estate in Wiltshire. The waters have not agreed with my constitution as I had hoped, and I find myself in need of familiar surroundings. I trust you will understand that Miss Pemberton's time and affections are her own to bestow. Your attendance at last evening's ball, while appreciated, has created certain complications that are best resolved through distance. I am certain a man of your intelligence and sensibility will comprehend my meaning. I wish you well in your future endeavours. Lady Hartwell Edward read the letter 3 times, each pass revealing new layers of dismissal. Lady Hartwell was removing Charlotte from Bath, from him, with the decisive efficiency of a general executing a strategic withdrawal. The message was unmistakable. He had lost his chance, had caused more harm than good, and was no longer welcome to pursue his suit. He should accept it gracefully, should acknowledge that Charlotte deserved better than a man who had spent months causing her pain, should return to London, to Greymont, to the safe isolation he had perfected over 2 decades. Instead, Edward found himself standing, shouting for his valet, demanding his coat and hat. The rain had intensified to a downpour, but he barely noticed as he stepped out into the deluge, making his way toward Queen Square with long, purposeful strides. He arrived at Lady Hartwell's lodgings to find the front door open, servants loading trunks onto a waiting carriage. Edward pushed past them into the entrance hall, water streaming from his coat, propriety abandoned entirely. Miss Pemberton, his voice echoed up the stairwell. Charlotte. A maid appeared on the landing, eyes wide with shock at seeing a duke bellowing like a common tradesman. Your Grace, I am afraid. Where is she? Miss Pemberton is in the drawing-room with Lady Hartwell, but they are not receiving— Edward was already moving, taking the stairs 2 at a time, ignoring the maid's protests. He reached the drawing-room door and pushed it open without knocking, without pause, without any of the courtesy his breeding should have demanded. Lady Hartwell sat by the fire, her expression shifting from surprise to severe displeasure. Charlotte stood by the window, a travelling cloak already fastened around her shoulders, and the sight of her prepared to leave, to vanish from his life again, sent panic surging through Edward's chest. You cannot leave, he said, the words emerging harsh, graceless. Not yet. Not until I have spoken. Your Grace. Lady Hartwell's voice could have frozen the Thames. This is most inappropriate. I must ask you to leave immediately. No. Edward kept his eyes on Charlotte, who had turned from the window, her face pale, her expression unreadable. I have been appropriate my entire life, and it has brought me nothing but misery. I am finished with appropriate. Your Grace, Lady Hartwell began again, but Charlotte raised a hand, silencing her. Let him speak, Aunt. Her voice was quiet, controlled, revealing nothing. I confess myself curious what could motivate such dramatic behavior from one usually so concerned with propriety. The challenge in her words stung, but Edward welcomed it. Anger was better than indifference. Engagement, however hostile, was better than absence. You asked me last night why I withdrew from you, he said, the speech he had rehearsed all night dissolving into raw honesty. You deserve an answer. I am certain His Grace's reasons are his own business, Lady Hartwell interjected sharply. Charlotte, we should— I am afraid. The words burst out before Edward could reconsider them, before pride could intervene. I have been afraid since the moment I met you, Charlotte. Terrified, in fact, and I responded to that fear in the most cowardly way imaginable. Charlotte's expression flickered, surprise perhaps or disbelief. Afraid of what, precisely? Of this. Edward gestured between them, helpless to articulate what he meant. Of what I feel when I am near you. Of losing control, of caring too much, of becoming— He stopped, swallowed hard. Of becoming my father. Silence fell, broken only by rain against windows and the crackling fire. Charlotte's eyes searched his face, and Edward forced himself to hold her gaze, to Let her see everything he had hidden for so long. "Your father died when you were 15, Charlotte said slowly, and Edward realized she had made inquiries, had sought to understand him, as he had never sought to understand himself. "He loved your mother very much. He loved her to madness." The words tasted bitter. "When she died, he could not, would not, continue living. He simply faded. I watched it happen over the course of a year. Watched him choose death over life because life without her was unbearable." Understanding dawned in Charlotte's eyes, but also something else, something that looked like anger. "So you decided never to love at all," she said. "You decided that protecting yourself from potential pain was worth any present loneliness, worth hurting others who might care for you, worth a lifetime of isolation." "Yes." Edward's voice cracked on the admission. "Yes, precisely that. Until I met you, and every defense I had constructed began to crumble. You saw me. Charlotte. Not the title, not the fortune, not the reputation. You saw the man underneath all that, and you did not look away. You gave me no choice but to look away." Charlotte's composure was fracturing now, pain bleeding through. "You withdrew. You made me believe I had done something wrong, that I was somehow unworthy of even friendship." "Never." Edward crossed the room in 3 strides, stopping just short of touching her, his hands clenched at his sides to prevent reaching for her. "You were never unworthy. You were our everything. Everything I wanted and could not allow myself to have. Everything I feared losing so much that I rejected it before it could be offered." Rain lashed the windows with renewed force. Charlotte's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and Edward felt his own throat tighten with emotion he had suppressed for too long. "Then you are a fool," she said quietly. "Love does not guarantee happiness, Edward, but neither does its absence guarantee safety. Your father chose grief over life, yes, but you have chosen fear over both, which is the greater tragedy." The use of his Christian name struck him with unexpected force. Charlotte had never used it before, had always maintained proper distance. Hearing it now, spoken with such terrible gentleness, broke something loose inside him. "I know," he whispered. "I know I have been a fool. I know I have hurt you through my own cowardice. I know I deserve your anger, your contempt, your complete rejection. But Charlotte, I am asking, begging for a chance to prove I can be better, that I can be worthy of your regard. You are a duke." Charlotte's voice was steady, but tears spilled over now, tracking down her cheeks. "I am nobody. Even if I believed your feelings sincere, even if I could forgive what you have put me through, we both know such a match is impossible. Nothing is impossible." Edward did reach for her then, taking her hands in his, feeling them tremble. "I do not care about society, about expectations, about any of it. I care only about you. You say that now while emotion runs high. But what about next week, next month? When you have time to reconsider, to remember your position, to realize what marrying me would cost you?" The question was valid, reasonable, exactly what any sensible woman in her position should ask, and Edward had no answer that would satisfy her, no proof beyond his word that he would not retreat again when faced with society's judgment. Lady Hartwell spoke from her position by the fire, her voice softer now but still firm. "Your Grace, I believe your feelings are genuine, but Charlotte raises a legitimate concern. You have a history of withdrawal when emotion becomes uncomfortable. How can she trust that this declaration will not end as your previous interest did, with her abandoned and wondering what she did wrong?" Edward released Charlotte's hands, stepped back, forced himself to think past the desperation clawing at his chest. They were right to question him. He had given them every reason to doubt his constancy. "I cannot prove my sincerity through words alone," he admitted. "I have spoken pretty sentiments before, and then retreated into silence. But I swear to you both, before God, that I am finished running from my own heart. Charlotte, if you leave today, I will not follow you again. I will not impose where I am not wanted. But please," his voice broke on the word, "please allow me the opportunity to demonstrate through action what I cannot adequately express through speech." "What actions?" Charlotte asked. "What could you possibly do that would—" "Return to London with me, now, today." The plan formed even as Edward spoke it, reckless and impossible, and absolutely necessary. "Let me court you properly, publicly, before all of society. Let me show you and everyone else that I am not ashamed of my feelings, that I will not hide them, or you." The suggestion was scandalous. A duke did not court a penniless companion openly. Such things were managed discreetly if they happened at all. The gossip would be ferocious, the social consequences significant for both of them. Charlotte understood this immediately. "You would destroy your reputation. I would save my life." Edward stepped forward again, desperate for her to understand. "Because this," he gestured to the elegant room, to the proper distance between them, to the entire structure of propriety that demanded they remain separate, "is not living. I have spent 19 years in a mausoleum of my own construction, and I am finished with it. I want to live, Charlotte. I want to feel, and I cannot do either without you." Silence stretched between them, heavy with possibility and fear. The rain continued its assault on the windows. The fire crackled and spat. Somewhere below, servants continued loading the carriage that would take Charlotte away, perhaps forever. "And if I refuse?" Charlotte asked quietly. "If I choose to leave Bath, as planned, to return to London independently, to—" she hesitated, "to accept Captain Worthing's attentions." The mention of Worthing sent ice through Edward's veins, but he forced himself to remain still, to accept her right to choose. "Then I will respect your decision. I will not impose further. But Charlotte, I am asking you to consider what we might have if you would allow yourself to trust me one final time." Charlotte turned to Lady Hartwell, a silent question in her eyes. The old woman sighed deeply, her stern expression softening into something like sympathy. "It is your choice, child, but I will say this. I have known many men in my 70 years, and few have looked at a woman the way His Grace looks at you. Whether that is reason enough to risk your heart again is for you to decide." Charlotte closed her eyes briefly, and Edward felt his entire future balance on the edge of her next words. When she opened them again, her expression was grave, decided. "I will give you 1 month, she said. 30 days to prove through consistent action that your feelings are genuine, that you will not retreat when challenged, that you can value me publicly as you claim to privately." "But Edward," the name emerged firm, claiming equality, "if at any point you waver, if you show even a hint of the shame you demonstrated in London, if you make me doubt my worth for even a moment, I will walk away, and you will never approach me again. Do you understand?" Edward felt something inside him simultaneously break and mend. Relief and terror warred in his chest. 1 month to undo the damage of a lifetime's emotional cowardice. 30 days to prove he could be the man she deserved. "I understand," he managed, "and I swear to you, I will not fail." Charlotte nodded slowly, then turned to her aunt. "Please send a servant to inform Captain Worthing that we will not be leaving Bath today after all. We return to London tomorrow on the morning coach. His Grace will make his own arrangements." It was dismissal, clear and courteous. Edward accepted it with a bow, understanding that Charlotte needed time to process what had just occurred, needed space to decide if she truly believed him. He left the drawing room, descended the stairs, passed through the entrance hall with its half-loaded trunks, and stepped out into rain that had gentled to a drizzle. The cold air shocked his system, clearing his head, settling the wild emotion into something more manageable. 1 month. 30 days. It was more than he deserved and less than he needed, but it was a chance. A final chance to prove that love was not weakness, that opening his heart would not destroy him, that his father's tragedy need not be his own. Edward walked back to his lodgings through streets washed clean by rain, his mind already cataloguing what needed to be done. Return to London immediately to prepare, secure invitations to every significant social event, make his intentions unmistakably clear to all of society. Court Charlotte not in shadowed corners, but in full view of the world that would judge them both. It was terrifying. It was necessary. It was, possibly, the first truly brave thing he had done in 19 years. And if he failed? If Charlotte walked away after 30 days of public courtship, taking his heart with her, then at least he would have tried. At least he would have lived. His father would have understood. Perhaps, finally, Edward understood as well. London welcomed them, with characteristic indifference. Grey skies, cold wind, streets teeming with post-Christmas commerce. Edward had arrived 2 days before Charlotte and Lady Hartwell, using the time to make certain arrangements and steel himself for what was to come. He had called upon various hostesses, secured invitations, dropped careful hints that his interests had shifted in an unexpected direction. The gossip had begun immediately, exactly as he had intended. When Charlotte's carriage pulled up before Lady Hartwell's Grosvenor Square residence on a frigid January afternoon, Edward was waiting in his own carriage across the street, watching, not approaching, not imposing, simply present, letting her know he had not forgotten, had not reconsidered, had not retreated. Charlotte saw him as she descended from the carriage. Their eyes met across the width of the square, and Edward inclined his head in acknowledgement. She hesitated, then nodded slightly before disappearing into the house with her aunt. It was a small gesture, barely civil, but Edward felt it like a benediction. The campaign began that same evening. Lady Pemberton was hosting a musical soirée, one of the smaller, more intimate gatherings that characterized January's social calendar. Edward arrived deliberately early, surprising his hostess, who fluttered with barely concealed delight at having secured a duke for her modest entertainment. When Charlotte entered with Lady Hartwell an hour later, Edward was in conversation with Lord Russell about agricultural reform, positioned perfectly to observe her arrival. She wore black silk tonight, simple and elegant. Her only jewelry that same small locket. She looked tired, Edward thought, shadows beneath her eyes suggesting she had slept as poorly as he had these past days. He waited until she was settled, until she had accepted tea and exchanged pleasantries with the other guests, before approaching. Not rushing, not presuming, but making his intention clear to everyone watching, which was everyone. Miss Pemberton, Lady Hartwell, he bowed to both. I trust your journey from Bath was comfortable. Quite comfortable, thank you, Your Grace. Lady Hartwell's tone was neutral, revealing nothing. She was watching him with those sharp eyes, assessing, judging. I wonder, Miss Pemberton, if you might favour us with a performance this evening. I recall your remarkable skill at the pianoforte from the Harrington musicale. It would be a gift to hear you play. Again, it was a calculated risk. Charlotte had been reluctant to perform at the Harrington gathering, and publicly requesting she play now, before all these witnesses, could be interpreted as presumption. But Edward wanted everyone to see him honouring her talent, elevating her accomplishment, treating her as worthy of attention and respect. Charlotte's eyes widened slightly, surprise perhaps, or wariness. I am certain there are others more qualified. There are none more gifted, Edward said, quietly, pitching his voice for her ears alone while maintaining perfect propriety. Please, I would consider it a personal favour. The addition of personal favour changed everything. A request from an acquaintance could be politely declined. A favour asked by a duke required serious consideration. Charlotte understood the distinction immediately, and Edward saw something flash in her eyes, awareness that he was beginning his promised courtship here, now, publicly, exactly as he had sworn. Very well, Your Grace, if Lady Pemberton permits. Lady Pemberton, hovering nearby, nearly fell over herself granting permission. Within minutes, Charlotte was settled at the pianoforte, the room's attention focused entirely upon her, and Edward had positioned himself where he might observe her face as she played. She chose the same piece she had performed at the Harrington musicale, that melancholic, yearning melody that had first revealed the depths hidden beneath her calm exterior. But tonight, something was different. The hesitation was gone. Her fingers moved across the keys with new confidence, new sureness, as if some barrier had been removed. Edward watched, transfixed, as music filled the small drawing room. He watched Charlotte's face transform, watched the way she lost herself in the performance, and understood that this unguarded revelation of self through art was a kind of courage he had never possessed. She was showing everyone in this room her heart, her soul, her pain, and hope and everything she felt, while he had spent a lifetime hiding all such vulnerability behind walls of propriety and rank. When the final notes faded, the applause was genuine and sustained. Charlotte rose, accepting the praise with modest grace, but her eyes sought Edward's across the room, questioning. What did you think? That look asked. Did I please you? Edward moved to her side immediately, claiming the privilege of escorting her from the instrument before anyone else could approach. "That was extraordinary," he said quietly, for her ears alone. "Thank you for sharing it with us. You asked me to play. I could hardly refuse a duke." The words were light, but Charlotte's tone held an edge. "I asked you to play because I wanted everyone here to witness what I have known for months, that you possess remarkable talent that deserves recognition and respect." Edward paused, then added, "And because I wanted an excuse to stand near you without appearing too obvious about my intentions." Charlotte's lips quirked despite herself, a small, almost smile that sent hope surging through Edward's chest. "I believe you are being quite obvious about your intentions, Your Grace. Half of London will know by tomorrow that you attended Lady Pemberton's musicale specifically to hear me play." "Good." Edward met her eyes steadily. "That is precisely my intention. I want all of London to know. And when they begin whispering about the Duke of Greymont pursuing a penniless companion? When the gossip becomes cruel, as it inevitably will, when your peers begin questioning your judgment, your breeding, your fitness to bear your title, then I will answer them with the truth, that I am pursuing the most remarkable woman I have ever met, and anyone who suggests I am somehow lowering myself by doing so is a fool whose opinion I do not value." Charlotte looked away, but not before Edward caught the shimmer of tears. "You say that now. I will say it tomorrow. Next week. Next month. For as long as necessary until you believe me." They were attracting attention, their intense conversation noted by curious eyes. Lady Hartwell materialized at Charlotte's elbow, a clear signal that the interaction had lasted long enough for propriety. "Your Grace, you are too kind. Charlotte, my dear, Lady Russell is asking about your sketches from Bath." It was dismissal, gentle but firm. Edward bowed his acceptance, allowing Charlotte to be drawn away into conversation with Lady Russell. But he remained at the musicale for another hour, visibly present, making it clear to everyone that his attendance had been motivated entirely by Charlotte's presence. The next morning, the first notices appeared in the gossip sheets. Nothing definitive, merely speculation about the Duke of Greymont's sudden interest in musical performances and a certain young lady's pianoforte skills. Edward read them over breakfast and felt grim satisfaction. Let them speculate. Let them gossip. Every mention made his intentions more public, more irrevocable. He sent flowers to Charlotte that afternoon, not roses, which would have been too presumptuous, but white camellias, which symbolized admiration and perfection. The accompanying note was brief. "Thank you for last evening's performance. It shall remain one of my treasured memories." Charlotte did not reply. Edward had not expected her to. He was proving himself through action, not demanding acknowledgement of every gesture. Campaign continued over the following days with methodical precision. Edward appeared at every gathering Charlotte attended, and he made certain she was invited to all the most significant ones by the simple expedient of letting influential hostesses know he hoped to see Miss Pemberton there. His presence guaranteed her invitations, elevated her social standing, made her inclusion necessary rather than merely charitable. He danced with her when opportunity allowed, but never more than twice in an evening. He engaged her in conversation about art, literature, current affairs, treating her as an intellectual equal rather than a decorative addition to the ballroom. He introduced her to political allies, artists, scholars, expanding her circle beyond Lady Hartwell's immediate acquaintance. And always, he was public about his admiration. He did not hide in shadowed corners or murmur private declarations. He praised her openly, defended her casually when critics whispered about her lack of fortune or family, made it unmistakably clear that he considered her worthy of his time and attention. The gossip intensified. Some of it was kind, celebrating a romantic attachment between a powerful duke and a deserving young woman. Much of it was cruel, questioning Charlotte's motives, suggesting scheming on her part, warning Edward about fortune hunters and social climbers. Edward endured it all with public grace and private fury. He could not respond directly to gossip. That would only feed the flames. But he could continue demonstrating through every action that Charlotte was not some opportunistic schemer, but a woman of remarkable character who had done nothing to pursue him. 2 weeks into his month of courtship, disaster struck. Edward was at White's conducting business with his solicitor when Captain Worthing approached his table. The captain looked furious, his usual easy charm replaced by barely controlled anger. "Your Grace. A word, if I may." Edward dismissed his solicitor with a gesture and regarded Worthing coolly. He had been expecting this confrontation since returning to London. "Captain, please join me." Worthing sat, his movements rigid. "I will be direct, as one gentleman to another. Your pursuit of Miss Pemberton is causing her considerable distress. The gossip, the speculation, the constant public attention, she is not accustomed to such scrutiny, and it is affecting her well-being." Edward's hands tightened on the arms of his chair. "Has Miss Pemberton expressed this distress to you directly? She has told me she feels overwhelmed, that she questions whether such public courtship serves any purpose beyond satisfying your need to demonstrate reform." The accusation cut deep, because it contained a kernel of possible truth. Was Edward's public campaign truly about honoring Charlotte, or was it about proving to himself and the world that he could overcome his fear? Was he considering her comfort, or simply his own need for redemption? "Captain Worthing, I appreciate your concern for Miss Pemberton's well-being. Truly. But this matter is between her and myself." "Is it?" Worthing leaned forward, his voice low and intense. "Because from where I stand, it appears to be between you, her, and all of London society. You have made her a spectacle, Your Grace. Whether you intended it or not, you have subjected her to examination and judgment she never sought." Edward felt cold certainty settle over him. "What would you have me do? Court her in secret? Hide my regard as if it were something shameful? I would have you consider what she needs rather than what you need to prove." Worthing's eyes were hard. "I would have you acknowledge that loving someone means prioritizing their comfort over your own pride." The conversation ended shortly after, both men too angry to continue civilly. Edward returned to his townhouse in a state of inner turmoil. Was Worthing right? Had Edward's determination to prove himself led to Charlotte's discomfort? He had been so focused on demonstrating his constancy publicly that he had perhaps failed to consider whether Charlotte actually wanted such public demonstration. That evening, he sent a note to Lady Hartwell, requesting a private audience. Not with Charlotte, but with the old woman herself. If anyone would tell him the truth about Charlotte's state of mind, it would be Lady Hartwell. She received him the following morning in her drawing room, her expression grave. "You wish to speak with me, Your Grace?" Edward remained standing, too agitated to sit. "Captain Worthing suggested that my courtship of your niece has caused her distress, that the public nature of my attention has made her uncomfortable. I need to know if this is true." Lady Hartwell studied him for a long moment. "Charlotte is not accustomed to being the center of attention. The gossip has been difficult for her. She questions whether she is equal to the scrutiny that comes with being attached to someone of your rank. She is more than equal. I know that, you know that. But Charlotte has spent her entire life being overlooked, dismissed, treated as invisible. Suddenly finding herself discussed in every drawing room, analyzed and criticized by people who have never spoken a word to her, it is overwhelming." Edward felt his heart sink. In his determination to prove his constancy, he had inadvertently created exactly the situation Charlotte would find most distressing. "What should I do?" The question emerged raw, helpless. "I cannot court her in secret. That would suggest shame. But I cannot continue causing her pain." "Perhaps," Lady Hartwell said gently, "you should ask Charlotte herself what she needs, rather than deciding for her what form your courtship should take." The suggestion was so simple, so obvious, that Edward felt foolish for not having considered it himself. He had been so focused on grand gestures and public declarations that he had forgotten the most important thing: Charlotte's own wishes, her own comfort, her own voice in determining how their relationship should proceed. "Would she speak with me? Privately?" "I will ask her." Lady Hartwell rose, moving toward the door. "Wait here." Edward paced the drawing room for what felt like hours but was likely only minutes. When the door finally opened, Charlotte entered alone, still wearing her morning dress, her hair simply arranged, her expression guarded. They stood for a moment in silence, the morning light slanting through the windows between them. "You wish to speak with me?" Charlotte asked finally. "I wanted to apologize." Edward forced himself to remain where he was, to give her space. "Captain Worthing suggested that my courtship has caused you distress, and Lady Hartwell confirmed it. I have been so focused on proving myself publicly that I failed to consider whether public courtship was what you actually wanted. I am sorry." Charlotte moved to the window, looking out at the square below. "The gossip has been challenging. People I have never met have opinions about my character, my motives, my worthiness to receive your attention. It is exhausting to be constantly examined, constantly found wanting. You are not wanting. I know you believe that." Charlotte turned to face him. "But Edward, you live in a world where your worth is assumed, where your position grants you respect regardless of your actions. I live in a very different world, where every gesture is scrutinized, where one misstep could destroy what little standing I have managed to achieve. The distance between our stations is not merely financial, it is fundamental." Edward crossed the room to her, stopping just short of touching. "Then teach me. Tell me how to bridge that distance in a way that does not cause you pain. Tell me what you need from me, and I will provide it. I need—" Charlotte's voice wavered. "I need to know that you see me as I actually am, not as some idealized figure you have constructed in your imagination. I need to know that you understand what you would be taking on by attaching yourself to someone of my background. I need honesty, Edward, complete, unvarnished honesty about what a future together would actually entail." "Then let me be completely honest." Edward took her hands, feeling them tremble in his. "A future with you would mean facing society's censure. It would mean defending our marriage to peers who believe I have married. Beneath my station, it would mean enduring gossip, managing disapproval, possibly being excluded from certain circles that value bloodline above all else." Charlotte tried to pull away, but Edward held firm. "But it would also mean waking beside someone who understands me, who sees past the title to the man underneath. It would mean conversations that challenge and stimulate rather than bore. It would mean music and laughter and companionship with someone I actually respect and admire. It would mean for the first time in my life not being alone." Tears spilled down Charlotte's cheeks now, but she did not look away. "And when the passion of early attachment fades, when reality sets in and you realize what you have sacrificed for this connection, when you wake one morning and regret your choice, then I will remember this moment." Edward lifted her hands to his lips, kissing them gently. "I will remember standing in your aunt's drawing room, holding your hands, and feeling more alive than I have felt in 19 years. I will remember that choosing safety over love left me empty, while choosing you, regardless of the cost, made me whole. You cannot know that. I do know it, because I have tried the alternative, Charlotte. I have spent most of my adult life avoiding exactly this kind of vulnerability, and it brought me nothing but isolation and regret. I am not promising perfection. I will make mistakes. I will sometimes let fear override good judgment. But I swear to you, I will not run again. I will not withdraw when things become difficult. I will stay and I will fight for us even when, especially when, society suggests I should do otherwise." Charlotte closed her eyes, and Edward felt her hands tighten on his. "I am terrified," she whispered. "So am I." Edward drew her closer until they were standing mere inches apart. "But I am more terrified of living without you than I am of facing any social consequences with you. Charlotte, I am asking you to trust me one final time, not with grand public gestures if those distress you, but with steady, consistent presence. Let me court you privately, if that is what you prefer. Let me prove myself through the small, daily demonstrations of regard rather than spectacular displays. Give me the chance to show you that I am capable of being the man you deserve." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant sounds of London beyond the windows. Charlotte opened her eyes, searching his face for something, reassurance perhaps, or certainty that he was being truthful. "1 month," she said finally. "You promised me 30 days. We have 16 remaining. And after those 16 days, if I have proven myself satisfactorily, what then?" Charlotte pulled one hand free and reached up to touch his face, her fingers gentle against his jaw. "Then we will see. Ask me again when the month is complete, Edward. Ask me when you have had time to truly consider what you are requesting. Ask me when you are certain." "I am certain now." "Then you will still be certain in 16 days." Charlotte smiled slightly, sadly. and I will have had time to decide if I am brave enough to accept what you offer." It was not the answer Edward wanted. He wanted declarations, commitment, immediate resolution, but it was honest, and perhaps honesty was more valuable than passion in this moment. He released her hands, stepped back, restored proper distance between them. "Then I will ask you again in 16 days, and every day between now and then I will demonstrate that my certainty does not waver." Charlotte curtsied, formal and perfect. "I look forward to seeing your demonstration, Your Grace." The return to formality was both painful and necessary. Edward bowed and left the drawing room, left the house, returned to his carriage with his heart simultaneously lighter and heavier than before. 16 days. He had 16 days to prove that love was not weakness, that choosing Charlotte over societal approval was the bravest thing he would ever do, that his father's tragedy need not be his own. The campaign continued, but shifted. Edward stopped attending every social event, stopped making Charlotte's presence the focus of public attention. Instead, he called upon Lady Hartwell's house each afternoon at precisely 3 o'clock, bringing books Charlotte had mentioned wanting to read, discussing articles in the newspapers, engaging in the kind of quiet, consistent companionship that built trust rather than spectacle. He sent no more flowers. He made no more grand gestures. He simply appeared, reliably, steadily, day after day, proving through unglamorous consistency that his regard was not dependent on passion or drama, but on genuine respect and affection. The gossip began to die down. London society, finding no new scandal to feed upon, moved on to other targets. And in the quiet that followed, Edward and Charlotte built something that felt more solid than anything Edward had known before. On the evening of the 30th day, Edward arrived at Lady Hartwell's house at 7 o'clock, dressed for dinner but carrying no expectations beyond the hope that Charlotte would at least speak with him. She received him in the drawing room, wearing ivory silk that made her look luminous in the candlelight. Her hair was arranged simply, her only jewelry that locket she always wore. She looked nervous, her hands clasped before her grey eyes watching him with an expression he could not quite read. "Charlotte," Edward bowed, his heart hammering. "Thank you for agreeing to see me this evening. You have been remarkably persistent in your attendance these past weeks." Charlotte's voice was steady, but Edward heard the tremor underneath. "I confess I am curious what you have to say now that your promised month has concluded." Edward moved to stand before her, not touching but close enough to see the pulse beating at her throat, to catch the faint scent of lavender that always seemed to surround her. "I love you," he said simply. "I'm in love with you. I have been since the summer, though I was too much a coward to acknowledge it even to myself. I love your intelligence, your grace, your quiet strength. I love the way you see the world, the way you make music, the way you refuse to accept easy answers to difficult questions. I love you not despite your lack of fortune or family connections, but because of who you are in yourself, independent of any external measures of worth." Charlotte's eyes filled with tears, but she remained silent, waiting. "I am asking you to marry me," Edward continued, his voice steady despite the fear churning in his gut. "Not because I need an heir, though I do. Not because society expects it, though they do. But because I cannot imagine continuing my life without you in it. Because every moment away from you feels empty. Because you make me want to be better than I am, braver than I have been, more honest than is comfortable." Still Charlotte said nothing, tears now streaming freely down her face. "I know I do not deserve your trust. I know I spent months causing you pain through my own cowardice. I know that accepting me means accepting scrutiny, gossip, possibly social exile from certain circles. But Charlotte, I swear to you before God and on my father's memory, I will never withdraw from you again. I will never make you doubt your worth. I will never hide what you mean to me, regardless of what society thinks. Will you marry me? Will you take the risk?" Charlotte stood frozen for a long moment, and Edward felt his entire future balance on the edge of her response. Then she reached up, undid the clasp of her locket, and opened it. Inside was a miniature portrait. Edward recognized it as one that had been circulating at a charity auction months ago, a tiny rendering of his own face. "I bought this in September," Charlotte whispered, "with money I could not afford to spend. I told Myself, it was merely admiration for the artist's skill, but I knew the truth. I have loved you since the Marlborough Ball, Edward, since you first looked at me as if I mattered. But I need to know, truly know, that you will not retreat when loving me becomes difficult. I will not retreat. Edward reached up to cup her face, his thumb brushing away tears. I swear it, Charlotte, on everything I am and everything I hope to become. I will not retreat. Then yes. Charlotte smiled through her tears, luminous and heartbreaking. Yes, I will marry you. I will take the risk. I will trust you one final time. Edward pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she might vanish, as if the moment might shatter. Charlotte wrapped her arms around him, her face pressed against his chest. And for the first time in 19 years, Edward allowed himself to feel the full weight of his emotions, without fear. They stood together, as darkness fell outside, as candles burned low, as London continued its endless rhythm beyond the windows, and Edward understood finally what his father had known all along, that this perfect, terrifying, precious connection was worth any price, that living fully, even with the risk of eventual loss, was infinitely preferable to the hollow safety of isolation. He had been so afraid of becoming his father, but perhaps his father's greatest gift had not been the title or the estates or the wealth. Perhaps it had been the demonstration, through his very devotion and subsequent devastation, that love mattered more than safety, that feeling deeply, even if it ended in sorrow, was better than not feeling at all. I love you, Edward whispered into Charlotte's hair. I will spend the rest of my life proving it. I know, Charlotte replied, and in her voice Edward heard not certainty about the future. That was impossible for any mortal to possess, but faith. Faith that he would try, that he would stay, that he would choose love over fear every day. For the rest of their lives, it was enough, it was everything. Outside, church bells rang the hour across sleeping London. Inside, a duke and a companion stood together in candlelight, no longer separated by rank or fortune or fear, simply two people who had found each other despite all the reasons they should not have and chosen to be brave. The wedding would come, the gossip would come, the challenges of merging their disparate worlds would come. But in this moment, holding Charlotte in his arms, Edward felt only peace. The kind of peace that comes from finally stopping the running, from finally accepting that vulnerability is not weakness, but the greatest strength any person can possess. He had spent Christmas Eve finding her room empty, realizing he had waited too long. But perhaps, and this was the thought that filled him with wonder, perhaps it had not been too long after all. Perhaps love, when genuine, created its own timeline, its own opportunities for redemption. Stay with me, he whispered, knowing it was too soon, knowing it was improper but needing to ask anyway. Not tonight, not that way, just stay, talk with me. Let me hold you. Let me prove that this is real. Charlotte pulled back slightly, searching his face, then nodded. I will stay for a while. They settled together on the sofa. Charlotte tucked against Edward's side, his arm around her shoulders, and talked. About everything and nothing. About their childhoods, their fears, their hopes. About music and art and politics and the absurdity of fashionable society. About the future they would build together. The challenges they would face. The life they would create from this impossible, improbable, necessary love. And when Lady Hartwell finally appeared in the doorway hours later, regarding them with an expression that managed to convey both exasperation and approval, Edward rose to leave with genuine reluctance. Tomorrow? He asked Charlotte at the door. Tomorrow, she confirmed. And the day after, and the day after that. It was a promise. It was a beginning. It was everything Edward had thought himself too damaged to deserve, and everything he now understood he could not live without. He walked home through dark London streets, his heart full, his future uncertain but no longer empty. And when he reached his townhouse, he went not to his study with its brandy and isolation, but to his chambers, where he slept peacefully for the first time in 19 years. Love had not destroyed him. It had saved him. And tomorrow and all the tomorrows after, he would prove himself worthy of the gift Charlotte had given him, the chance to live, to feel, to love without fear. The Duke of Graymont had found her room empty on Christmas Eve, and realized he had waited too long. But he had found her again, had fought for her, had proved himself brave enough to risk everything for love. And in the end, that was all that mattered.